Hi, I'm Caitlin, a podcast producer here at C-SPAN. This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, theologian Jim Wallis argues that a faith of love, healing, and hope must be used to dismantle a false gospel that promotes white Christian nationalism.
Since March 19, 1979, C-SPAN, a public service funded by the cable television industry, began giving you direct access to government in an innovative way by putting you, the viewer, into the rooms where politics is debated and policies are determined. C-SPAN began as a bold initiative. Now, 45 years later, we are essential for those wanting to see democracy at work, without editing or commentary. With continued cable support, we've done this without a dime of government funding, maintaining our independence. As we mark 45 years, the business of media is rapidly changing, and now your support is crucial for our mission's future. Support our legacy of unfiltered access by donating today at cspan.org/donate. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. What will be an amazing conversation with Reverend Jim Wallis. He is the author of several best-selling books, including the new New York Times best-selling book, The False White Gospel, Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy. He's an American theologian, a writer, a teacher, a political activist. He is the founder and editor of Sojourners magazine, and most importantly, perhaps, he has been a baseball coach for 22 years. Welcome, Reverend.
Little League baseball coach. That is the most important thing.
That is, and I must ask you, what is your position of choice, sir, in baseball?
Well, my sons play college baseball now, and they're first basemen. They're hitters and first base. I played shortstop, but couldn't hit the ball as far as they both do.
You, sir, have succeeded as an American dad, and I would say as a fantastic American and as a great Christian who has lived a fascinating life, and I think that life and the wisdom is in this book. And let me shamelessly promote this book again. I'm not getting paid for this yet, but it is a fantastic book, and I appreciate you writing it. The title is a mouthful, and I want to dissect it. You're talking about rejecting Christian nationalism. How would you, Reverend, define Christian nationalism in 2024 America?
Great question, and I talk about it in the book as white Christian nationalism. The name spells the problem. First of all, we have this gospel of Jesus, the most inviting, welcoming, inclusive message in the world that becomes white. That's a problem. Then the word Christian, but it doesn't mean service and sacrifice and love. It means control and domination. Christians should be in charge. They should have preference. They should rule somehow. And there's an old theology called dominionist theology. This goes way back, so this isn't new. That Christians should be, and white Christians, in charge and control, and nationalist. I'm getting up in years now, but I wasn't there for the ascension of Jesus. But I have read about it. And what he told his followers was go into all the world, making disciples in every nation, observe whatever I have commanded you. So most of this book is about iconic biblical texts, particularly teachings of Jesus. What did he say? What did he mean? And what does that mean right now?
And, in the book, I went to an all-boys Jesuit Catholic high school, by the way, so I read the Bible, even though I'm a Muslim, and I think you'd be proud to learn that I got the highest grade every semester in religious studies class. And you're reading this book, I saw a lot of these passages, these beautiful passages that you have brought forth, that you are, in a way, reinterpreting, trying to take it away from white Christian nationalism. But I want to stick with Christian nationalism, and specifically, why do you think it's a threat right now? And before you answer, I want to mention this report. I'm sure you know this report. In February 2022, a report was released by Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty and Freedom from Religious Foundation, in which they said that Christian nationalism was a, quote, major motivator for the violent coup and failed insurrection of January 6th.
Well, indeed. I'm at Georgetown. I'm the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Chair of Faith and Justice. He was a mentor of mine, a dear friend. And Georgetown had the first imam as a chaplain of any university. So we are a multi-faith Jesuit school. So I'm glad to be there. I would say when you mentioned January the 6th, I think Jesus suffered identity theft on January 6th. You had people who were carrying Confederate flags, American flags, Trump flags, and some carrying Jesus flags. And when these violent insurrectionists stormed the Capitol and took the Senate, they shouted Jesus' name in their prayers. So to me, that's an abuse, a manipulation of false religion. And so a lot of people think the answer to bad religion is no religion. I disagree. I think the answer to bad religion, which Christian nationalism is better faith, good faith. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is reframe and refresh these ancient texts, which do apply not just to people of my faith, but to Jews and Muslims and people of goodwill. A lot of my students would call themselves, they affiliate none of the above with the religious categories. They check that box. So they're the NONES, the nuns. And that's not a secular movement. That's a lot of young people. It's not, they do believe in God. Most of the nuns believe in God or something bigger than themselves. But they don't affiliate with religion because of what we're doing and not doing, or saying and not saying. So to me, this is really a critical moment for genuine faith, good faith, true faith, to express itself and speak and act and have a conversation with those who I think are doing bad religion.
And, you know, as a Muslim and as a person of faith like you, many in my community feel like the religion and the prophets have been hijacked. That's a word that has often been used by extremists who have made Jesus and Prophet Muhammad into sidekicks that they use and abuse for ideologies of supremacy and power. And in the United States of America, and especially in this book, you talk about white supremacy and how it's tied to Christian nationalism. Can you explain to the viewer how white supremacy functions with Christian nationalism in America right now?
Yeah. Well, we have to go back to our beginnings. And this doctrine of discovery, it was called, came to America and literally eradicated indigenous people almost entirely to steal their land. And then we kidnapped Africans to turn into a brutal chattel slave trade for free labor. That was our beginnings. And that, what I call America's original sin, is a sin. And repentance from sin doesn't mean just feeling sorry or guilty. In Islam and Judaism and Christianity, it means turning around. Stop your direction, going in a wrong direction, turn around and go in a different direction. So I want to bring us back to the beginning, before our beginnings, which was in the first chapter of the first book of Genesis. There's this text that I turn to in the book. And I love this text. Imagine you and I are surrounded by political noise all the time. We just have to listen to all that. A lot of your viewers feel the same way. They're surrounded by noise and they're very weary of it. And then the text says, then God said, be quiet, listen, then God said, and here's what God says, let us create humankind, that's all of us, in our own image and our likeness. The creation of all of us, humankind, God's children, in God's image and likeness is the foundation for all of our earthly talk about human rights, civil rights, and voting rights. So in that chapter, I apply Genesis 1:26 to voting rights. And I say any suppression of a vote or intimidation of a vote or subversion of a vote because of skin color or any other reason is literally an assault on the image of God, on Imago Dei in the Greek, on Imago Dei. And so Islam, Judaism, Christianity all teach that. So let's go back to the beginning, the real beginning, and how it undoes and needs to transform our beginnings as a nation.
You know, in the book, like you mentioned, you cite several of these beautiful verses that many of us know. And it's almost this juxtaposition between these verses and what many Christians in America now believe. So let me give you an example. According to a PRRI report that was done in conjunction with Brookings in 2023, white Christians in America are, quote, notably more likely to view immigrants as, quote, an invading force, more than any other religious groups, including 61% of white evangelical Protestants believe this, 51% of white Catholics, and 46% of white mainline non-evangelical Protestants. How do we reconcile that with verse Luke 10:25?
Well, that treatment, that language about immigrants going on all over the place, the othering of immigrants is directly contrary to what the Bible says. In particular, let me go to Matthew 25 first, which was my conversion text. Jesus says, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was a stranger. The word stranger means immigrant. That's what the word stranger means. I was sick, I was in prison, and you weren't there for me. You didn't welcome me. And they said, Lord, when did we see you hungry and thirsty and naked, sick, and prison? As you've done to the least of these, he says, you've done to me. So how we treat immigrants, the text says, is really how we treat Christ himself. And for Luke, this is the wonderful Good Samaritan parable, which is known to a lot of your people, whether they're religious or not. And I love this story. Here's a man, he's beaten by the side of the road. He's left for half dead, robbed, and there he is. And all the Jewish scholars tell us he's a Jew. And then this lawyer comes to Jesus and says, and I learned from my study of this text that the lawyer was a Washington lawyer. He was a Washington lawyer. I know that tone of voice, right? He says, so what do I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, well, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and then you love your neighbor as yourself. And how you love your neighbor will test your love of God. So he says, well, who is my neighbor? Now that's the most important question for a democracy. Who is my neighbor? John Meacham, the great historian, says, unless we treat our citizens, fellows, as neighbors and not enemies, we're in deep trouble here. So Jesus uses an example of the neighbor in this Samaritan. Now, the Judeans, Jesus' audience here, none of them thought there were any good Samaritans. They were mixed race, half breed. They were false worshipers. They were dangerous. Stay away from them. It's all through the New Testament. Yet one who is an other sees one lying on the side of the road who's an other to him and whose people have otherized Samaritans like this Samaritan. Yet he stops, and the other helps one other to him. This is a transforming parable, and it could help, the Good Samaritan could help lead us, I think, to a genuinely multiracial democracy. And the title of that chapter is Your Neighbor Might Not Live in Your Neighborhood. Who our real neighbors are, is what Jesus is trying to say here. And they're the ones who are different than you.
And
powerful message.
And that's the Jesus that I encountered when I was taught by Jesuits in an all-boys Jesuit Catholic high school in the mid-90s in the Bay Area. And yet, here we are where the neighbors, right, whether it's undocumented immigrants, whether it's Muslims, whether it's LGBTQ people, whether it's black people, whether it's Christians who disagree with MAGA, whether it's Democrats, they're seen as invaders, as vermin. They're seen as a force that is trying to replace these individuals. And, I want to go back to that study, that report that was done by PRRI, because nearly 1/3 of white evangelicals, regardless of party affiliation, Reverend, express support for political violence. Among Americans with a favorable view of Trump, 41% of people are open to violence from true American patriots who feel that they're being replaced by not these neighbors, but invaders. And the Jesus that I encountered now has been transformed into this weaponized warrior who will be resurrected with an AR-15. Can you explain the shift of this reimagining of Jesus, not as a person who welcomes a neighbor, but will be armed to the teeth and repel them at the border if necessary?
It's not a reimagining, it's a manipulating. It's a distortion, using religion for power. I'm very startled and concerned about those numbers that you just laid out for us. And a lot of people are saying, a lot of your media colleagues are saying, this is a test of democracy, this election coming up. It's not the usual Republican Democrat. I always say, don't go left, don't go right, go deeper. There are deeper issues here. It's a test of democracy. I think the biggest test in my lifetime, or really since the Civil War. But this book says it's also a test of faith. Test of democracy, but a test of faith. And those numbers point this out so dramatically. It's a test for faith communities. Are we going to be and say who we say we are, or are we going to be manipulated by political trajectories? Here is, I'll just say it, the Donald Trump political trajectory is fear to hate to violence. That's now our trajectory. You make people afraid, cause them to hate the vermin, the animals, all these names are being used. These are people made in the image of God from our Genesis. And then violence becomes acceptable. And Jesus' way is not this way of violence. So I want to change the trajectory of politics by raising the meaning of faith here. So let's have a discussion. Let's have a conversation about what these texts mean. And when Jesus says how you treat the immigrant or talk about the immigrant is how you treat or talk about me. That's what the text says. So let's hold people accountable, particularly those who say they're Christian or they're holding up Bibles or they're selling Bibles for their own gain. Or literally, one of the posts that most has struck me, I'll just say, was the one that Donald Trump put up of a court scene, and he's at the defense table, and next to him at the defense table is a cartoon of Jesus at the defense table with Donald Trump. He's more than any other past presidential candidate, he's comparing himself to Jesus Christ. And then he says, I'm being indicted for you. Oh, Donald, that's not true. And the way you treat immigrants and the way you talk about them before coming into a courtroom is literally anti the teaching of this Jesus. So I'm saying I am raised evangelical Christian family. I was raised on that. And it's wrong. It's just wrong and must be confronted. And let's have a conversation. When Donald Trump holds up his Bible, okay, Donald, what does the Bible say? Let's open it. Let's read it. What does it say? And what do you believe about that? And you're next to Jesus on this defense table by your ad for yourself. What did Jesus say about how to treat the poor, the immigrants, those who are sick, those who are in prison, mass incarcerated? How do we treat people? So I want the faith factor to be decisive in this election campaign. Not just the democracy factor, that's crucial, but the faith factor. What does our faith mean? Christian, Jewish, Islam, what does our faith mean? And how do we apply our faith to this political dialogue, so important for this election year?
I want to get into that later on in the conversation, specifically how we reach out to faith-based communities who I think are also being manipulated by fear. But if you don't mind me asking, as a Christian, as a person who believes in God and believes in Jesus and the true Jesus, how does it make you feel personally when a twice impeached vulgarian who was held liable for sexual assault by a jury of his peers compares himself to Jesus and holds the Bible? I mean, just the emotional, visceral reaction that this person is branding himself as the warrior for Christianity and Jesus.
Well, you recall he got a general to clear the nonviolent, peaceful protesters from Lafayette Square, and he went to St. John's Church. Now, I know St. John's Church. I know the rector, the bishop there, no permission, and he holds his Bible, ironically, revealingly upside down. He's not comfortable with his Bible. He held it upside down, and now he's selling one. So that is the initial visceral response is like the bishop when she was called by everybody was just stunned. Here he's doing this after pushing protesters out. And so the first response is, I can't believe this. So this is stunning. But now I'm saying, and in this book I'm saying, let's take the Bible back. Let's take the Bible back to him and his supporters and those who are Christians, and let's say, what does the Bible say? If you're going to hold it up like that, you need to be accountable to what it says. So I'm trying to go through what does it say in relation to behavior, language, who you attack, policies. Let's bring some accountability here. I don't want to just be appalled. I want to bring back what biblical faith really does mean, and the teachings of Jesus, which can be listened to by anybody, no matter what their faith. This is contrary to the Bible, contrary to what Jesus taught. So let's deal with that in this election campaign, and not just be appalled, but take the Bible back to him and his surrogates. And I think there are persuadable people out there. I think I wouldn't have written this book if I didn't think there were persuadable people. And so there are a lot of people who are stuck, who are confused. In fact, Jesus said, one of the texts I explore in this book is John 8, you'll know the truth, says Jesus, and the truth will make you free, which means to me now, the opposite of truth isn't just lies, it's captivity. Loss of freedom. Truth and freedom are indivisible. And a lot of people out there, good people out there, are captive. They're captive. They're stuck in believing all these lies. And they're just, so let's have a conversation that can help set captive people free and go back to what Jesus and the Bible really say.
You mention that verse, and you talk about it in your book. There's a chapter specifically, John 8:32, which I want to quote. If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And yet, here we are in 2024 America, and according to the polls and studies, a majority of Trump supporters, many of them who are Christian, believe in conspiracy theories such as QAnon and the deep state and the replacement theory. And I'm sure you've seen these very disturbing polls that say they believe Trump more than their own pastors and family members. The question I have then is, how do we win over these people when they believe their own truth and they live on Earth 3, and anyone who gives them a contrary truth to what certain news stations and certain media give them, they're seen as the enemy of the people?
Well, you're a journalist, and you see also how the world, we're now divided into literally parallel universes of facts. When I was growing up, we watched after dinner every night, our family, Walter Cronkite. Only a half hour of news every day. Walter Cronkite said, and he ended by saying, and that's the way it is. Now, you might not have liked the facts you heard, and there was certainly racial bias in those days, and black events didn't get covered much. But most people believe that's the way it was. Now, we don't have any agreement on how it is, and people believe these lies. And as you say, websites and conspiracy theories and QAnon and whole networks that are deliberately lying. And there are very few places where people can, of different political persuasions, can find agreement on that's the way it is. That's the way it is, to quote Cronkite, is a real danger right now for immigrants, immigrant families, for black pastors who call me and they're afraid of the policing of their children and young people in their youth group. And so and I've learned over the years, what changes people is proximity, is ideology. And so we have been separated from each other. And when white evangelicals get to know immigrant families, refugees, and they take them in, it's transforming, So how do we create places, environments where we get proximate to each other? And how that conversation takes place is crucial. Now, I can't calculate in Pennsylvania, Michigan, that's where I went in this book tour, first of all, to these states. When you have 500 people show up in Grand Rapids, Michigan for a conversation, you know something's going on. So how do we have these conversations back in our communities, show up to school board meetings, show up to candidate forums, show up to local meetings and make your voice be heard? So a lot of the times I'm in Boston here, we had a great conversation last night, and I said, don't walk out of here saying, finally, a good conversation on faith and politics. Take the conversation out of here, into the streets, into congregations and mosques and synagogues and Christian churches. Take it there and let's have a conversation. So I want to make the faith factor a factor in this election here, not just accept bad religion. And King said it well. He reminded the churches, he said, we are not the masters of the state. We are not the servants of the state. We are the conscience of the state. That's what we have to become again. And I think a lot of people are stuck and they're captive, and they need to hear the truth so they can be set free.
You know, you talk about proximity, and I love a good superhero origin story. Let's take the DeLorean back several decades when you were a young white teenager in Detroit. Can you tell us how your proximity and your relationship with black churches really helped formulate not just your faith, but your commitment to social justice? You talk about it a little bit in the book, and I think it'll be very inspiring for our listeners right now.
Well, I'm in Detroit. I'm in a white church, a white school, a white neighborhood, white evangelical church. And at 15, 16, I began to listen to my city. It means reading the papers, hearing the news, watching carefully, having my first conversation with adults. And something really big seemed really wrong. And I couldn't get anyone in my white world to talk about it. Why is life in black Detroit so different than life in white Detroit? At least that's what I'm reading and hearing. They said, I don't know, it's always been that way. And I hear there are black churches. How come we've never been or been visited? Well, I don't know. One honest answer I got, son, if you keep asking these kinds of questions, you're going to get into a lot of trouble. That's proved to be true. So I tell my students at Georgetown, I tell them, trust your questions and let them take you wherever they lead you. And for me, my questions took me to the city, what we called the inner city in those days, and just a few blocks or miles from where white people live. And I showed up, I got jobs in places where young black men were working like me. I was working for money for college. They were supporting their families. And I met these young men whose life stories were so different than mine, so different. And their life stories, being proximate to them, began to change my life story. And I had these, to use a religious word, epiphanies, revelations and realizations. And one night, one of my buddies, we were janitors at Detroit Edison, and he took me home to meet his parents. His father had passed, his mom was still, and siblings. And we got talking about the police, and she said, which his mom said, yeah, that's why I tell my children, if you're ever lost and can't find your way home, and you see a policeman, duck under a stairwell, hide behind a building, and when the policeman passes, get up and find your way home on your own. And when she said those words, not a militant person, political, just a mom caring for her kids, my mother's words to her 5 children screamed into my head. If you ever lost and can't find your way home, look for a policeman. The policeman is your friend. He'll take you by the hand and bring you home. And I began to realize that here's this black family still waiting to be included and to be secure and safe. And I learned it applied to everything else too. And so I began to look at this structurally. And my dad was a Navy veteran, came back from the Pacific. He was a mechanical engineer and a destroyer. He came home, and all the GIs, like my dad, got FHA loans for their first house. Got a GI Bill, which free education. So education and housing make you middle class. My government made our family middle class. Biggest affirmative action program in the nation's history. No black sailors on his ship got FHA GI Bill. No black GIs anywhere got that. If they had, I wouldn't have been in an all-white neighborhood, an all-white school, an all-white church. It's racially stressed, strategic racialized geography to keep us from having proximity with each other. But I was blessed. I went to the black church and just showed up, and they took me in and answered my obvious naive white boy questions. And one of those young black church leaders that I met is now 95, and I was with him after an event in Los Angeles. He was the dean of Fuller Seminary, and he's still an elder to me. And I've met people. My life has always been changed by going to where I was never supposed to be and meeting people I was never supposed to meet or know or talk to or become friends with. That's what changes us. So I feel deeply grateful. I'm going back to Detroit again in 2 weeks, in Lansing and all over the state. But that's what we need. We need to have places, platforms. And to me, three of them are congregations, schools, and sports. And I think that proximity, for example, Little League baseball coach. So I got these 12-year-old kids, and we had some conversations after games or at practice about these things. So with the permission of the black players, I said, to the white players, your teammates here, your black teammates and classmates, they all have a talk with their mom or dad about the police, how to behave in the presence of the police, what to do, what to do, not to do with your hands, how to be careful. And so some of the black players said the talk they had with their parents, shared that with the white players who never had that talk, and their white, liberal, progressive parents didn't even know what's going on. But when we got finished with the talk, it's not true that these white players felt, as sometimes people say, guilty and responsible and terrible about themselves. No, they're pissed at this happening to their black teammates and classmates. And so I'm in touch with lots of them now. They're in college or finished with college, and they're still doing work in systemic racism. So this is systemic. It isn't just personal, it's structural. And we need to confront these structures that have this embedded in them and change them. And I think we can, and I think we could do this in a way we've never done it before. But first, we have to win this battle for democracy and the integrity of our faith in the next 6 months.
You mentioned systemic racism, and the name for that is white supremacy. And as you know, white supremacy dies hard and it reinvents itself. And in this current moment where we are struggling for our democracy, white supremacy and some of these individuals, white Christian nationalists, have been using cultural wedge issues to try to win over people of faith. It's happening in my community with Muslims, it's happening with African American Christians, with Latinos, and specifically what they're doing is demonizing LGBTQ. And they're saying, listen, come to us because at least we believe in religious freedoms, and look, we all dislike the same group, and then they're promoting conspiracy theories, and you're seeing it, Reverend, win over folks in the suburbs. You're seeing them win over enough people that said, aha, the LGBTQ and the woke are taking over. In this particular moment, where you might disagree with me, I think it's a tactic of some of these individuals to do a divide and conquer. What do you recommend to faith-based communities, communities of color, to not fall for the trap?
Well, as you point out, just to say, LGBTQ are all initials that stand for people who are beloved of God. Let's start with that, beloved of God. And no one can challenge that. And whatever discussions we have to recognize the dignity and the humanity of all those who are being othered by politics. And so, to my point last time in your last question, white evangelicals and black evangelicals are very different. The word white evangelical, that phrase, the problem with it is the word that controls the phrase isn't evangelical. It's white, not Christian, but white. And black Christians have often helped teach me the way forward here. So how do we challenge what you're saying they're doing their fear, their wanting to deny the dignity of people who are different than they are. Uh, how do we do that religiously and theologically, not just politically? I don't think we're going to win this battle with politics by itself, certainly not partisan politics. How do we get to the deeper questions about what kind of nation do we want to be? What kind of, and I think it's things that people can do uh, where they are. Everybody who's listening here is an influencer somewhere. You have places and spaces where people listen to you. And so how do we do that? How do we, this book's full of stories about people doing that, ordinary people. And one of them it's a favorite of mine, is one of my team has a father who's a Scottish, he's a Presbyterian minister, Presbyterian minister in rural Georgia. So there he is in rural Georgia, and his wife is in the choir, as is often a pattern, a spouse in the choir, and they practice before every service. And so here they are practicing one Sunday morning. And then the choir master says a prayer at the end of the practice. And she's not militant, political, right-wing bigot. She's just scared. She's scared about what she's hearing on the news. So she says, "Oh, Lord, please protect us from those cartels of immigrants who are coming with disease and drugs and rapists and criminals, and protect our soldiers who are fighting to protect us." And the pastor's wife says, "Stop, stop, stop. That's not true, and we don't lie in church." That's not true, and we don't lie in church. So she says, "We can discuss that, but that's not true, and we shouldn't lie in church." Now, she had authority to stand up and say, "This isn't right," right? So how do we do that? How do we use Thomas Merton, who's, as you know, from a Jesuit school, the Catholic monk, said, everything is about relationships. And I think that's true. And so I'm saying, let's build on our relationships. Let's go home, and my students, and talk to family and friends and friends in our congregations, interfaith. So we have this thing called Faith, plural, United to Save Democracy. Faith United to Save Democracy. Black clergy led, but imams have joined, rabbis have joined. We're in 10 critical states where voter suppression is on the rise. I call it lawyers and collars. Lawyers are there to make sure things go well, but the collars are there to provide a kind of authority and a presence. And we teach people, we've trained 1,000 already. And people can find out by going Faith United to Save Democracy. They can find it, our training guides. And we've trained 1,000 whole chaplains already so far to be in these very inbound places in de-escalation. How do we de-escalate confrontation and potential violence? And how do we make sure that people have the right to vote fairly, equally? So I want to put faith into practice and not just talk about it and these critical times ahead. You know, the Bible has two kinds of time. One is chronos, tick-tock, tick-tock. Other time the Bible calls, other kind of time they call kairos time. Kairos time is a time which changes time, changes events for a long time. We're in a kairos time now with this election. This isn't just an every 4-year thing. This is a time where we decide what kind of people, what kind of nation, who we're going to be, and who we as people of faith are going to be. And whether people of faith or not, all of my students there, they check the none of the above category. They don't affiliate with religion per se. Yet most believe in God or something bigger than they are. And they're looking for authenticity and courage and inclusion. That's what they're looking for.
You know, speaking about winning people over in relationships and trying to protect this thing called democracy, it oftentimes happens at the ballot box. And you might disagree with me on this, but I have often told Democrats that they are terrible when it comes to talking to religious communities, people of faith. Oftentimes, some of their ambassadors and politicians don't mention faith. They see the ground, which then is taken over by, I think, bad faith actors who make Jesus into a mascot. Or they mock and ridicule religious beliefs. And I have always told them that if you reach out And if you speak with some religious values, you can win over these communities. And so because this election, I think you and I agree, is so instrumental to the future of this country, the character of this country, how would you recommend Democrats, specifically politicians, reach out to these faith-based communities that could be won over, but oftentimes they don't hear any faith-based values or messaging from Democrats?
Well, I don't disagree. I agree strongly with that. And I'm saying that to my Democratic friends all the time. I did an earlier book called God's Politics. The subtitle was Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It, which is still true. And so there are Democrats like Senator Chris Coons, Raphael Warnock, talk about faith very freely. But many don't, and they're afraid of it. And I run into, I'll be blunt, I run into people who I call secular fundamentalists.
Oh yeah, many of them.
Opposed to religion per se, and they really don't want to talk about it, and they want to think all religion is bad and wrong. So, and that's a mistake. It's a fundamental mistake. Now, I don't want either side to use religion and manipulate it for a partisan cause, but they should talk about their values, what motivates them. And if faith is part of what motivates them, Democrats or Republicans, they should talk about it and what it means. So let's have a conversation. And I've had conversations up on the Hill. I remember when they put, these immigrants in cages, these asylum, and they put their kids in other cages and deported some of those kids. And members on the Hill, Republican and Democrat, people of faith, were very appalled and concerned and didn't know what to do. And the Republicans were afraid of speaking out because it was their president who was doing this. And I remember a meeting that I was invited into in the back office, quiet office of the senator with colleagues, Republican and Democrat. So small, senators were sitting on the floor. And we talked about our faith, and they all were people of faith. And we talked about the Good Samaritan parable, like we just did here. And out of that came a letter, a strong letter. 9 Republicans signed it, telling President Trump then, stop doing this, stop having this policy that separates families. And so I think I'm not going to give up on faith or concede it to these right-wing political people who are just power politicians. So I say movements have to decide who they can persuade, but also who they must defeat. I mean non-violently at the ballot box. But there are power brokers now, religion, political power brokers, who just want power. And they're going to do that by any means necessary. And I hope in this conversation we help to persuade people, and that those people be defeated at the ballot box.
You mentioned this a couple of times about the rise of the nuns, right? The folks who might be spiritual, but they don't want to be affiliated with religious groups or institutions, and they see religion and religious communities as instruments of oppression. Specifically, they cite homophobia, misogyny, and racism. And according to the Pew Research Center, 2024, this data just came out, 28% of Americans now classify themselves as, quote, nuns. 17% of whom identify as atheist, 20% as agnostic, and 63% as, quote, nothing in particular. Most nuns said that they were actually raised to be religious, and the majority were raised in Christian households. What message can you give them? How can you sell it to them without selling it to them? That faith is a force of good, and faith offers hope and goodness in times that seem utterly hopeless.
Preach it, preach it, preach it. So let's talk about I'm glad you raised them, because I did a pop quiz last night. I'm with a lot of Harvard Law School and other students were there. It's Boston. So I said, here's a pop quiz. What's the fastest growing denomination in America? And the fast growing is the nuns, those who check that box, that affiliation box. And they're looking for something different. And in my classes at Georgetown, on the last day of class, which for me is next week for the semester, we'll talk about the class, and I'll invariably hear, I was nervous about religion, and I don't want to push down my throat, but that didn't happen here. You just raised how it could be a force for good. And some of them said, now remember, it's Georgetown, Jesuit School. I've never heard about Catholic social teaching before.
Mm.
I've never heard about the Black Church before, but I like what I'm hearing. And so I'm more open to that now than I've been before. So this is going to be a time when a new generation, they're watching us. They're watching faith communities and how we respond to the moral issues and values in an election like this. And I think, they're paying attention to what we say and do. And a lot of them want to be mobilized to help. We're going to send students to help with polling places in nearby states and big phone banks and pizza and phone banks about making sure people are registered and can get out to vote and have a ride at the polls and all that stuff. Because we want people to vote. And we just learned that in Ohio, 6,000 voters were purged from the rolls. And turns out they're mostly Black voters who were purged. Now they would find out in November that they're not registered when they thought they were and went to vote. So now Black churches in Ohio are having, on Sundays, nonpartisan, want to make sure you know if you're registered or not. So they can find out in church if they're registered, or, Aunt Grace is and Mama's not. And so here we are, Black churches. Again, it's voter registration, nonpartisan. And where we're having to repair these systems. And so I think this is a time that if young people see us standing up and speaking out as people of faith, from whatever tradition we're from, this movement, Faith United, is multi-faith,
Mm-hmm.
multiracial, and multi-generational, all at the same time. So to me, that's the future, that's the hope. How can we live democracy in a pluralistic American society where all of us belong?
You start your book with this quote from Pope Paul VI: "If you want peace, work for justice." As we're speaking right now, there is a multi-faith and a multiracial movement across colleges, Jews, Muslims, Black folks, white folks, and nuns, who want peace and justice in Palestine and who want a ceasefire. They are being doxxed, they're being targeted, they're being harassed, the police are being unleashed against them, they're being called terrorists. You've been through that as well. You stood for civil rights, the protests against apartheid, the protests against the Vietnam War. What advice do you have to these students, these growing coalition of students right now who are standing up for peace and justice? Overwhelmingly, most of them are peaceful, and they're being attacked.
Well, that's happening at Georgetown. It's happening everywhere. And in my class, after October 7th and the brutality that we saw, this all came, and then Gaza and the brutality, it was evil on October 7th, and evil what's happening in Gaza. In my classes, I have progressive Jewish women and Palestinian women in my classes.
Mm.
And so we had some time to listen to each other and talk with each other and trust each other. And there are deep sorrows on both sides that aren't connecting, and deep truths that aren't connecting. So how do we stand up for those who are suffering, particularly women and children, those who have nothing to do with the violence that's being committed? How do we change our minds and then change policy? We have to change policy in the U.S., and we can't pay for those big bombs that are killing children. We can't do that. So how do we find our way back and stand for the values that we say we believe in? Children are equally valued, Palestinian or Jewish, equally valued. How do we stand for that and make sure people know what we think? And we've got to change policies that are decades in the making and been wrong for decades. How do we change? How do two peoples live in peace in Palestine? How do we get behind that and support that. The only way to find security is to find security for all sides, all those people, all those children. And that's what we have to protest for and fight for.
And you mentioned that in the book. You cite Matthew 5, verse 9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." I don't think anywhere in the Bible it said, "Blessed be the war makers." But correct me if I'm wrong. I just went to Jesuit school. You're the Reverend.
Well, I'm glad you keep coming about these texts, because the heart of the book is that for me. What Jesus doesn't say, in fact, I've done this with some these conversations. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peace lovers," right? They say, no. Oh, okay. Blessed are the peacekeepers, right? They say, no. I said, well, we all love peace, we say. And we all want to keep the lid on, peacekeeping, which just supports an unjust status quo. Blessed are the peacemakers. And then he gives them that designation, "For you'll be called the children of God," which is extraordinary. Now, peacemakers is conflict resolvers. That's what it means. So a whole lot of young people are going into conflict resolution as a vocation, a career. It's an art and a science. We need peacekeepers right now in this electoral season, in the most polarized time that I've ever seen in my life. And people on the Hill that I know on both sides say it's never been so polarized. So that text, we have a whole discussion of that in the False White Gospel, is about what it means to be peacemakers right now in the middle of all this. And if we are peacemakers, Jesus says wonderfully, we'll be called the children of God.
I have 5 more minutes, and I'm going to be as ambitious as I can and try to get in a couple of questions. And I'm going to do a nerdy religious question for you, and to make you unpack it. Because speaking about texts, in your book, you also cite Matthew 25:31. And Jesus says that the people will be divided into 2 groups, and they'll be judged: the sheeps and the goats. The sheep will be welcomed and praised for serving those in need. In 2024, Reverend, in America, who are the sheeps? Who are the goats?
Well, Jesus makes clear in that text was my conversion text. It brought me out of the student movement back to Christ, because I had left the church, kicked out of my little church at 15. Because here Jesus is saying, I call it the "it was me" text. I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked, I was sick, I was a stranger, I was in prison. And all the people thought they were his followers. Lord, when did we see you? If we had known it was you, we would have at least formed a social action committee in our church or something, right? But that text goes to the heart of things. Jesus' economics in that text turns our politics upside down. And that's what I want to see. So we've taken that text to Capitol Hill to fight for a child tax credit, which is in battle right now. We're in battle for that, which would end child poverty, reduce it more than anything else. It has after the pandemic. So I want to bring these texts right to the streets and to policy. And I think that text clearly says, and the biblical prophets all say, rulers and princes are judged, not for their gross national product or their military firepower, but how the poor and vulnerable are doing in their midst. That's the test, and that's what we have to go by.
So you're saying that billionaires should get more tax cuts. Is that what you're saying? I think that's what you're saying, right? Tax cuts for more billionaires and more profit,
Tax
correct?
cuts for more billionaires is the policy that Donald Trump wants again, and many of his colleagues do, and no child tax credit for poor families and kids. This is it's hypocrisy. It's also evil. So tax credits for the rich and nothing for the poor, when these child tax credits, and we're across the board. We have faith leaders called the Circle of Protection, and we're Roman Catholic bishops, the National Association of Evangelicals, all of us, different histories, but we're for a child tax credit because it's a right, and it's consistent with Matthew 25.
And, when that child tax credit passed, it just did an amazing job to reduce poverty in the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth, which is the United States of America.
46%, almost half, cut child poverty by almost half. And now we didn't renew it. And we must. It's a faith issue for me.
And, it should be an issue of decency and morality for most. In the final 3 minutes that I have with you, we talk about children right now. And in this book, you said you wrote it for the next generation. You've lived a wonderful life, an eventful life. And with your life of service and activism and social justice, in the final 3 minutes that we have, what advice would you give this young generation, the best advice that you have learned from your experiences? And what is a regret, a mistake that you made that you don't want them to repeat so they can be even more successful in this pursuit of justice and peace?
That's a great question. I teach at Georgetown because of the vocation of my students. And I say there's a difference in career and vocation. Career is, your assets, your GPA, your rising up the ladder of ascent. Vocation is it's your gifts. What's down deep? What do you feel most deeply about? What's the gut stuff? What are you really good at? What you're really good at and the crying needs of the world come together. That's your vocation. So we wrestle with all of that. So I tell them this book is dedicated to my son Luke, my son Jack, Luke's new wife Anna Sophia, and my students, who I think are going to significantly change these things that we're talking about. We have to win this battle, but I think this generation is going to change things. And my advice to them is don't give in to cynicism. Skepticism. It doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter if we vote. Because the powers that be fuel cynicism and skepticism because it makes people withdraw. So I say, don't withdraw, engage. This system has to be transformed, absolutely. But you got to save a democracy to transform it. And so I have learned over the years when I have, or my students have, or activists have become cynical, we play to the hands of the status quo. So we can't let that happen. And so one of my students, when I came into class, Tyree had just been killed the day before, a young black man. And she says, I feel so jaded. It keeps happening, all these shootings, and the systems are so corrupt. And I said, yeah, but do you want to be known as the jaded generation? She says, oh, no, whole class. No, okay, let's fix this stuff. Let's fix this stuff. And your generation are the ones who can do it.
I appreciate your work. I appreciate your service. I appreciate your attempts to make faith in Jesus a voice, a movement of peace and justice. And I appreciate this book, The False White Gospel, Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy. New York Times best-selling author, Reverend Jim Wallis. It was a pleasure.
Indeed, a blessing for me, a blessing for me.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.